As well get started. Hang on just a second. I'm just going to post it. As well get started. All right, hang on just one second. Okay, never mind. They turned off the water. Okay. All righty. So no one else is showing up yet. Sad face. All right. Good evening, comrades and audience members. Tonight we will commence with our reading of The Philosophy of Nature by G.W.F. Hegel. This will begin with a discussion of Hegel's introduction, which contains an extended discussion of how thought is present in physics, what nature is as a notion or concept, really, and to give the divisions or table of contents of the philosophy of nature. So, the knowledge of nature is a complicated object. Our coming to know it can be sought through the practical approach, the theoretical approach, or through, as Hegel will detail, the unity of the two while taking into account their differences. Just saying this in general isn't going to give you a very great idea of what it means, but it should become clearer as we go along. The practical approach in general yields a definite result. The theoretical one, on the other hand, is harder to grasp, and indeed, even Hegel does not fully present an articulated definition of it. So, yeah. Let's see here. So we've got the text up. We are not going to read this page by page, word by word, but just discuss its contents. And just to start off, Hegel talks about how the philosophy of nature in his era is in considerable disfavor. The scientific community in Hegel's day pretended that the complete lack of method and scientific procedure was the acme of scientific procedure. This, in part, I think, had to do with Kant's pointing out that reason for humans is limited and therefore should not be relied on for anything beyond subjective knowledge, and that objective knowledge is sort of out of our grasp. And this was in reaction to the I guess sort of the inadequacy of the empiricists and their ability to not only gather scientific information but also order it correctly. Let's see here. Uh, okay, I think we're going to start with this quote really quick. Hegel says that the physics and natural history are called empirical sciences par excellence. and they profess to belong entirely to the sphere of perception and experience, and in this way to be opposed to the philosophy of nature, i.e., a knowledge of nature from thought. Okay, and just to repeat that, the philosophy of nature is a knowledge of nature from thought. In other words, organized by thought, and in Hegel's case, in a logical manner. The fact is, however, that the principal charge to be brought against physics is that it contains much more thought than it admits to and is aware of, and that it is better than it supposes itself to be, or if perhaps all thought in physics is to be counted a defect, then it is worse than it supposes itself to be. Physics and the philosophy of nature, therefore, are not distinguished from each other as perception and thought, but only by the kind and manner of their thought. They are both a thinking apprehension of nature. All right. So, whether or not one accepts a metaphysical grounding for physics and the hard sciences in general, they definitely exert an influence, and the more unexamined that they are, unfortunately, the more sort of arbitrary is their organization, if that makes any sense. I'm going to stop there. Kyle and Jim, if you'd like to comment or say a word from your readings. I'm just going to pause there.
I think I raised a question in the chat about what was the relationship between what Hegel called philosophy of nature and what contemporary philosophers would call the philosophy of science. And I think they stem from different intellectual traditions. Modern day philosophy of science stems from people like Ernst Mach and all the people that he influenced, and by the logical positivists and by Popper, and then by the people who are reacting against the positivists and against Popper. And I think I think that's really a different enterprise than what Hegel was interested in. Hegel, I think, harked all the way back to Aristotle, actually.
Mhm.
He pretty much says that himself. So
Yeah, I'm interested. I'm interested to figure out what the present day philosophy of science, you know, what its relation both to the hard sciences as well as to a philosophy of nature consists of, because we definitely haven't found our way back to a fully conscious metaphysics that takes nature logically into account the way Hegel does, and you know it's probably the single most important, what do you call it, uh, inflection point for the continuation of physics and its ability to get itself out of its current crisis, which has been the case for over 100 years now. Really, you know, you'll find texts going all the way back into the 20s and even the teens talking about the crisis in physics and
I
how,
didn't know about that. I didn't.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And even Hegel hints at it in his work that, scientific endeavor only gets so far, especially with unacknowledged metaphysical organization of the information and the logical implications involved. Let's see here. Okay, so um,
There we go. That was going to say, I think there is that kind of still that general trend of some form of empiricism, a lot of different of this more fundamental areas of physics that, like you said, unquestioned metaphysics, because metaphysics doesn't exist, kind of thing. And
Yeah.
then there is a pushback. There's starting to be some kind of pushback against that. Been happening in the past few years in response to that crisis. Because
Big
one
issue is
person,
string theory.
yeah, or it's part of that works.
In string theory, main problem is string theory can't be tested, can't be falsified, can't be verified. So what is it? Is it a scientific theory or what?
Yeah, and the
Right.
philosophy of science does try to answer those questions about what's falsified and what's verified, and try to move beyond Popper. For one thing, Popper's uh, formulation, and the closest that I've heard they've gotten is to refer to Whitehead and to others who try to bring movement into the question. And of course, Hegel wrote the book on dialectical uh, dialectical thought when it comes to these things. Of course, none of them want to talk about his contribution.
A
Yeah,
lot of commentators will say that Whitehead was influenced by Hegel. As far as I know, Whitehead didn't hardly mentions Hegel in his writings.
see,
Yeah,
also, I was gonna say, I think Carroll, when it talks about like the common understanding of Popper's falsifiability is a caricature of it because it's like it's an either or.
Yeah,
yeah,
I have to read it more, but it's like Popper certainly wasn't that, you know, dualist, or he was very much more as a spectrum of that kind of thing. So I'm kind of interested in what that is because don't have that. I mean, I did history of science as my honor stuff in college, but I didn't get much past that.
mm.
I mean, at least I got to read Gould, I guess. That reminds me.
Yeah. That's cool. I don't think I've read Gould in a classroom setting, and I have yet to get to him um, like read one of his works from cover to cover, but I really should. I think um, it's just another one of those things I got to
My
get to.
professor did manage to tell Kuhn, he was still alive, that he was using his book for class.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
cool. So, moving on, Hegel gives us an extended section he calls Ways of Considering Nature, in which he moves from sort of the motivation nature gives to people to look into it. And, for lack of a better word, it's wonder that he sort of um, gestures to. Nature, at first glance is wonder all around us. Um, our um, okay, all right. So our approach to nature is partly practical and partly theoretical. An examination of the theoretical approach will reveal a contradiction, which thirdly will lead us to our standpoint of a notion of nature. To resolve the contradiction, we must incorporate what is peculiar to the practical approach, and by this means, practical and theoretical will be united and integrated into a totality. In man's practical approach to nature, the latter is for him something immediate. Nature is immediate to man and external. He himself is an external and therefore sensuous individual. Although in relation to natural objects, he correctly regards himself as an end. A consideration of nature according to this relationship yields the standpoint of a finite teleology. And with this, the practical approach, Hegel breaks it up into three sections. Okay. The first section is the individual products of nature, which are its concern, i.e., our concern. Something occurs in nature, some object we find, Those products are for our ends as human beings. This is the practical approach. Our ends, our purposes, rather, human purposes convert nature into means. That's the second, what you see up here with B, right? And the third, which is the result is our satisfaction through that means. Okay, so a practical approach to nature is pretty simple. Nature provides products for us. We turn them into things for our purposes, and we derive satisfaction as the result. It's pretty simple, pretty immediate description of what humans do with the products of nature. The cunning of his reason enables him, man, to preserve and maintain himself in face of the forces of nature by sheltering behind other products of nature and letting these suffer her destructive ends. So that's a good example of a purpose for us. Now, teleology, human purpose, has become discredited as an argument for the wisdom of God or nature because the practical approach deals with trivial finite ends, such as, nature makes shelter. We hide under the tree. Therefore the tree gives us shelter. So, the tree as shelter is sort of our description of an object in nature. Doesn't really give us much of a description of the tree, though, as it is in and for itself. You know what I mean? Like the wood, the leaves, how it's growing up out of the ground. It's said none of this is referred to in the practical approach, unfortunately, and this is why it's become discredited. And as we know, the notion of end, of purpose as immanent in natural objects is their simple determinateness, i.e., what they are, right? And that's what we need to seek for over and above our purpose. Hegel says the true teleological method consists in the method of regarding nature as free in her own peculiar vital activity. Okay, hang on just a second. So, he says physics today does not. I'm not sure where he wrote this. Let's see here. So physics today does not start from external determinations like our purposes, and it is directed to knowledge of the universal aspects of nature, forces, law, genera, arranged in orders and classes, etc. This is an implicit universal. Okay. The philosophy of nature is a comprehending treatment. The explicit universal, on the other hand, considered in its own immanent necessity in accordance with the self-determination of the notion. So here Hegel is giving, as you can see here, I'm just highlighting this, our first provisional definition of what nature and more specifically, the philosophy of nature is supposed to be, in terms of what it gives us for comprehending nature. All right. Not only must philosophy be in agreement with our empirical knowledge of nature, right, but the origin and formation of the philosophy of nature presupposes and is conditioned by empirical physics. However, the course of a science's origin and the preliminaries of its construction are one thing, while the science itself is another. In the latter, the former can no longer appear as the foundation of science, i.e., knowledge that's sort of discovered and then sort of stacked up bric-a-brac, right? That can't be the foundation of knowledge. Here, the foundation must be the necessity of the notion, okay? I.e., it's logical. It's logical unfolding in much the same way as we encountered in the science of logic, which takes the concept from the most abstract to the most concrete form. Okay, and And I'm just going to finish up by really quick talking about the theoretical approach. So here you can see in the theoretical approach to nature, the idea is to stand back from natural objects, leaving them as they are and adjusting ourselves to them. Here we start from our sense knowledge of nature. Okay. The second step is that things acquire the character of universality for us, or that we transform them into universals. Okay. The more thought enters into our representation of things that we have, as in the previous paragraph, stood back from and looked at as they are, so-called, right? The less do they retain their naturalness, their singularity, and immediacy. Hegel is very poetic in trying to describe this process, okay? The wealth, so he says, the wealth of natural forms in all of their infinitely manifold configuration is impoverished by the all-pervading power of thought, okay? Their vernal life and glowing colors die and fade away. This is very poetic. The rustle of nature's life, just think of hiking through verdant jungles filled with ferns and whatnot, right? The rustle of nature's life is silenced in the stillness of thought. Her abundant life, wearing 1,000 wonderful and delightful shapes, shrivels into arid forms and shapeless generalities, resembling a murky northern fog. Okay. So what he's talking about is that as we represent nature as we see it, it changes from what it is immediately through our senses into this other form that is so alien to it that it virtually negates what at first we see. All right. The result, which is the gamma here. Hegel does not give us a definite definition. In fact, the definition is actually the extended discussion below this point of the notion of nature. Look at that. He did. He takes several pages just to get to the fact that nature, as the result of our theoretical approach, is very complicated and has to integrate the practical. Is kind of what he gets at. What does he say here? The difficulty arising from the one-sided assumption of the theoretical consciousness that natural objects confront us as permanent and impenetrable objects is directly negated by the practical approach, or negated by the practical approach, which acts on the absolutely idealistic belief that individual things are nothing in themselves. The defect of appetite from the side of its relationship to things, i.e., our need for the natural objects for our purposes, is not that it is realistic toward them, but that it is all too idealistic, right? We turn trees into umbrellas, right? They're not really umbrellas, but for our purposes, they are, right? And this is a very idealistic conception. Philosophical, and here's Hegel's kind of conclusion on this. Philosophical true idealism consists in nothing else but laying down that the truth about things is that as such immediately single, sensuous things, they're only a show in appearance. Okay, as we take nature in, taking it in as it immediately is, as that reflection, should be part of the process, but it is definitely not the end. An end that defines nature as it really is, if that makes sense. Yeah, and he kind of ends by saying externality constitutes the specific character in which nature as nature exists. Okay, and then my notes kind of peter off into the notion of nature, which we'll talk about. There's a great deal in this section that I didn't get to in my notes, where he talks about where he talks about the fact that present day for Hegel philosophy is the philosophy of identity. And he talks about this elsewhere in the logic as well. Here it is. The philosophy of nature takes up the material which physics has prepared for it empirically at the point to which physics has brought it and reconstitutes it so that experience is not its final warrant and base. Basically, the application of metaphysics to what physics has prepared for it, if that makes sense. Physics must therefore work into the hands of philosophy in order that the latter may translate into the concept, the notion, the abstract universal transmitted to it by showing how this universal as an intrinsically necessary whole proceeds from the notion. The philosophical way of putting the facts is no mere whim, once in a way, to walk on one's head for a change. I'm reminded of what people say about Marx and Hegel. After having walked for a long while on one's legs, or once in a way to see our everyday face bedaubed with paint, no, it is because the method of physics does not satisfy the notion that we have to go further. What distinguishes the philosophy of nature from physics is more precisely the kind of metaphysics used by them both. For metaphysics is nothing else but the entire range of the universal determinations of thought, as it were, the diamond net into which everything is brought and thereby first made intelligible. This is a hallmark of Hegel's system. It's repeated in the phenomenology of spirit, in the logic, and pretty much everywhere. And what he's talking about here is it's not enough to have all of the information you've accumulated up about whatever scientific subject you've made, right? At the point of just gathering data, you just have data. It has to be organized into a system of knowledge in which the data is organized such that it all points to itself, is self-subsistent, that it doesn't rely on an external skeleton key in order to be able to make sense of it. It's its own skeleton key, right? This is what self-reference, subsistence means. Okay. Let's see.
I was thinking those examples where we've had the data but didn't have the conception to see the proof in the data until later.
Yeah.
Also, was going to say in here, there's the sentence that begins of all revolutions. All revolutions in science is no less than world history originate solely from the fact and spirit in order to understand and comprehend itself with a view to possessing itself, has changed its categories, comprehending itself more truly, more deeply, etc. That's just straight up scientific revolutions right there.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Kuhn definitely made a study of Hegel, and I would hazard to guess that he had a copy of this book on his shelf.
And
there's just no other way to look at Kuhn and he
has a known history of forgetting to record his sources.
Which, I mean, it's fine. And
yeah.
if you live in the academy, okay, and are into the hard sciences, excuse me, and even some of the soft ones, reading Kuhn on scientific revolutions is a sort of upper higher education graduate requirement. Like it's like a first year requirement to understanding how information is to be organized once you have it sort of compiled. If you're an astronomer and you've spent 5 years gathering data, what do you do with this data? How is it to be organized? Well, Kuhn talks about it, and Hegel here specifically gives you a good, solid conception of why it needs to be organized metaphysically, as opposed to just arbitrarily based on the previous era's arbitrary standard. You know what I mean? That arbitrary standard is not going to give you all of the knowledge about all that data. On the other hand, if you're able to organize that data to where it points to itself as opposed to something outside it, that then you've got a self-subsistent notion of that particular section of nature, in that case, astronomy. That was a lot. I'm going to stop talking for a minute, and you guys can, Kyle, if you want to grab a hold of this, if you've got a quote to show or whatnot, go ahead. Yeah, there's a lot in this section that I didn't even get to, but it's just,
No, I was just noticing I highlighted on 13, there you go.
yeah.
I think you probably highlighted it too. Just that that God reveals himself in two different ways as nature and as spirit, which just reminded me of Spinoza.
Yeah. Yeah. Spinoza, if you look at God or nature as being revealed in two different ways, Spinoza starts from the substance, and the substance is subdivided into extension, which is nature. Well, extension is the physical space, and then thought is the second one. I forget what Spinoza calls it in his system, but yeah, the the determinations sound different, but if you remember that both Hegel and Spinoza are presenting all of reality as one, as opposed to two, like Descartes, then you'll see spirit or soul and nature as one in the same, not one in the same, but two modes of one in the same substance. Yeah, that's a better way to put it. Sorry.
Spinoza believed there was an infinite number of different modes, but we're only familiar with two of them.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've read it. I've read it to where substance has an infinite. The form, the infinity of physical and thought forms is a far more, I think, exacting description, because if substance is infinite, first of all, but if we can only find two forms that we can refer to, then that begs a lot of questions. But if you think of it as two modes in which there are infinite, both external and internal to the brain forms, then it sounds a lot more like itself. Sorry, I'm thinking on the fly here, but you know what I mean. Because in extension, reality is finite, but it is also infinite, and so yeah. So it's 8:40, and we need to get on to the notion of nature. Is anyone waiting in the waiting room, or?
No, no waiting room. They would have just joined.
Okay. Just curious. That's all right. So the notion of nature. So Hegel says in 247, nature has presented itself as the idea in the form of otherness. Since, therefore, the idea is the negative of itself or is external to itself, nature is not merely external in relation to this idea. The truth is rather that externality constitutes the specific character in which nature as nature exists. So Hegel, in starting to construct the notion of nature, starts from the logical, its logical definition as it emerged out of the absolute idea in the previous book, the Science of Logic. And for our audience members, you're probably thinking, okay, this seems extremely abstract and moreover universal, and that's because it is. But the universal, as it is now, without determination, nature is a determination in the idea. At this point, hasn't been specified at all, and so it's at its most abstract form. Okay. Let's see. So the philosophy of nature itself belongs to this path of return, for it is that which overcomes the division between nature and spirit and assures to spirit the knowledge of its essence in nature. So let's see here. First, the different moments remain preserved in the eternal unity of the idea. The other to this extreme is individuality, the form of finite spirit. The third form, which concerns us here, the idea in the mode of particularity, is nature, which lies between the two extremes. Okay? This form presents the least difficulty for the understanding. What he means by this is that any one of us, in encountering nature, we go out and we encounter a natural object like a tree, right? The the form of particularity that is nature is the least difficult to understand for our common sense reasoning. Okay, we see a tree, we know it's a tree. We know what its function could be for us, and roughly what it looks like. We can gather data about it. It's not that hard to translate that form into thought and be able to start gathering scientific data about it. Whether you're talking about a tree or a rock or anything else that you find in nature. Let's see. So Hegel, hang on a second. I had some notes on this. I think the notion of nature is at first grasped in pictures, representations, and metaphor. Hegel leans heavily on the biblical forms at first because they are the most prevalent metaphor available. And that's really the case with some of the texts that you see here. He talks about God, therefore, in determining himself, remains equal to himself. The different moments remain preserved in the eternal unity of the idea. This is the Logos, the eternal Son of God, as Philo conceived it. So he's sort of grabbing onto these metaphors and sort of narrating them through. Yeah, he says the individual man grasped as also in unity with the divine essence is the object of the Christian religion. And this is the most tremendous demand that can be made on him. Yeah, and then it gives the quote, which I just gave. As regards the first meaning, which is the different moments that are preserved, after removing the sense of the absoluteness of the world, we are left only with eternity in connection with the conception of time. Philosophy is timeless comprehension of time too, and of all things generally in their eternal mode. So he's starting to talk about what nature is in this conception. Let's see here. So about time and eternity, the following can be said. Eternity is not before or after time, not before the creation of the world, nor when it perishes. Rather, is eternity the absolute present? Hang on just a second, if you could. Um, yeah, nor when it perishes. Rather, is eternity the absolute present, the now, without before and after. The world is created and is now being created and has eternally been created. This presents itself in the form of the preservation of the world. Creating is the activity of the absolute idea. The idea of nature, like the idea as such, is eternal. In the question whether the world or nature in its finitude has a beginning in time or not, one thinks of the world or nature as such, as the universal. And the true universal is the idea. The finite, however, is temporal. It has a before and after, and when the finite is our object, we are in time. It has a beginning, but not an absolute one. Let's see here. Yeah. Um, in our ordinary way of thinking, the world is only an aggregate of finite existences, but when it is grasped as a universal, as a totality, the question of a beginning at once disappears. Where to make the beginning is therefore undetermined. A beginning is to be made, but it is only a relative one. We pass beyond it, but not to infinity, but only to another beginning, which, of course, is also only a conditioned one. In short, it is only the nature of the relative which is expressed because we are in the sphere of finitude. Okay, and you remember the infinite series in the logical, in the science of logic. This kind of speaks to that in in the mode of nature. Um, so, all right, I'm gonna stop talking for a second. Uh, you guys take this up. Move around the text. I have to go uh, attend to my kids for a few seconds. I'll be right back.
No, kind of thinking at the point where like Einstein talked about the block universe and like how time is a persistent illusion.
Yep.
Like at this point it's like, well, yeah, you're thinking from an eternal dead form of time, not from the finite moving form of time. They're both equally valid viewpoints at the same time, right? It's kind of just points out to me that you kind of need both viewpoints to be accurate.
And Noza said something about that in the ethics. He talked about in what sense is the human mind eternal? Eternal. Because on the one hand, Spinoza basically denied personal immortality, but on the other hand, he was not willing to say that the human, but there wasn't aspects of the human mind that aren't eternal. He said they were, and what he said about eternity was very similar to this, I think.
I'm not gonna go find that one teleology book that seems like a philosophy of time that seems to dive into different conceptions of time that might actually play into that too.
Yeah.
It's always funny kind of finding proper philosophy in theology books, and then of course nothing philosophical in science, some science texts. Or seem more rational in theological than you see in science sometimes. Finite has
Yeah, they said 100 years ago was a different story in physics.
yeah.
I mean, people like Einstein, Bohr, Heisenberg, they all discussed philosophy very openly, and they didn't, and they all took the position you couldn't really do high level theoretical physics without discussing philosophy. They all held that view.
Yeah, would you say at a certain point we've kind of come back to a Kantian understanding of metaphysics and science at this point? It's detached, rationality is detached from empiricism, basically.
Oh, Einstein became very influenced by neo-Kantian philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
and he was
Right.
very specific about that too. So
Right. Okay. So it is a literal thing. Okay.
yeah,
Thought so. Ooh. Well, I guess we're right to come back. I thought it was also interesting Hegel brings up that infinite time is merely a human conception.
yep,
It's not the same thing as eternal.
yeah.
Which that's we're going about straight into time here anyways, right? Yeah. Goes on for a while enough and then place motion. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, Jim.
Yep.
I'll put it over there. Okay.
Yep.
Is it, okay. So I guess the next point this is the part I'm just trying to think I was fine conceptualizing here that really kind of gave me a good understanding of where we're going is the fact that necessarily that externality being the next kind of quality here basically is why in science everything is contingent because externality is indifferent to everything else, just like quantity was. And so they come together in any order without even Laplace's demon being able to predict exactly logically ahead of time. Because Laplace's demon is still characterized in mechanics. Hmm. The mercy affords a superior ground.
Okay, folks, I'm back,
Yeah.
more or less. So yeah, we're gonna go over time tonight, definitely, but that's all right because
Yeah, you can go back.
yeah, you're fine. Actually, this is a good place to be. So for members of the audience and just for us in general, you notice how in this introduction in which he starts talking about the notion of nature, he starts from a very indeterminate place before starting to go through what it makes, what makes it up to get to the concrete place. But again, it's like the preface in the phenomenology or in the science of logic, in that the notion of nature can only really be grasped in full in its unfolding. Okay. So like the preface, this, basically what I'm presenting tonight, as a journey from the abstract to the concrete, is only a preliminary sort of summary, right? And some of it's not going to make sense, and some of it is honestly going to sound quite outlandish to most people's ears about science and the history of science and what chronology in nature is supposed to look like with regards to forms of life, right? It's one of the things that a lot of people turn away from the philosophy of nature about, because they don't get that Hegel's presentation is a logical one and not a historical one. Okay. This is much easier to deal with, I think, in the science of logic, because at the end of the day, you're just dealing with categories of thought and categories of being in their logical unfolding. When you're talking about nature, which is a much more concrete subject, yeah, natural logical. Yeah, exactly. As we, I know, as we discussed before, and that's I think more Houlgate's
Yeah,
description than anything.
it's just
So
a flavor of logic. Is all it really is.
yeah, exactly. And that flavor, that flavor takes into account both the practical and the theoretical idea or uh, not idea, but practical and theoretical approach to nature. So I'm just going to read this. In this externality, which is nature, the determinations of the notion concepts have the show of an indifferent subsistence in isolation in regards to each other, and the notion, therefore, is present only as something inward. Consequently, nature exhibits no freedom in its existence, but only necessity and contingency. Hang on just a second. Yeah. So when we talk about nature only really exhibiting necessity and contingency, but no actual freedom, it's really how it appears to us. Okay. When he talks about it being a show of indifferent subsistence and isolation, this is how it appears in our thought processes. Okay. As a show. Here's a practical item around us, the whole of nature, and it appears to us, right? It was a much more abstract concept to deal with in the doctrine of essence and the science of logic. Here, it's actually applied to natural objects in all of their forms, right? We take it in through our senses, and it appears to us that all of these objects stand isolated from each other. They're not related to each other. Of course, that's just a show. That's just the effect of our thought born reflection about them, if that makes sense. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to go to this quote. In nature, not only is the play of forms a prey to balance and unchecked contingency, but each separate entity is without the notion of itself. The highest level to which nature attains is life, but this, as only a natural mode of the idea, is at the mercy of the unreason of externality, and the living creature is throughout its whole life entangled with other alien existences, whereas in every expression of spirit, there is contained the moment of free, universal self-relation. Hegel, in this section especially, compares what spirit is in and for itself to nature as a conception. And the way he puts it sounds very outlandish. He calls nature the unresolved contradiction or the self-degradation of the idea, right? And yeah, it is only to the external and immediate stage of consciousness that is, to sensuous consciousness, the nature appears as the first, the immediate, as mere being. And yeah, so he's talking about the logical conception of nature as opposed to what it is in and for itself and its history and so forth. Let's see here. The infinite divisibility of matter simply means that matter is external to itself. The immeasurableness of nature, which at first excites our wonder, is precisely this same externality. It is only in life that we meet with subjectivity and the counter to externality. Okay, so when talking about reality, Hegel conceives of reality as a system that includes logic, nature, and spirit. When you're talking about just one of these three big circles, right? They're going to look incomplete, okay? And this gets to the spirit of why he calls nature the self-degradation of the idea, how nature is the unresolved contradiction. He's talking about nature in relation to the whole of reality that also includes logic and spirit. Okay. And yeah. And because it's a part of a whole. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So the organic body, yeah. Yeah, I'm just gonna keep reading this. The organic body is still a whole composed of many members external to each other, but each individual member exists only in the subject, and the notion exists as the power over these members. Okay. Thus it is that the notion, which at the stage of notionlessness, nature, is only something inward, first comes into existence in life as soul. Nature is the first point in time, is first in point of time, but the absolute prius is the idea. This absolute prius is the last, the true beginning. Alpha is omega. What is unmediated is often held to be superior, i.e. nature is held to be superior, the mediated being thought of as dependent. And historically, this is correct. First in point of time is nature, then humans evolved, and humans in evolving gave birth to thought in their brains. Okay? In the logical order, because the idea is the prius, how do I say this? Historically, it's the last, but when thought regards reality, right? It's working from within itself out to what reality is. And this partially, and I think this reflects why Hegel goes in the order logic, nature, spirit, is because working from within thought, as humans do, and being able to organize that information, it has to start with itself, look outside itself, and then bring all of that back into itself. And that, in a nutshell, that description describes the dialectical process as a whole. When you're talking about reality, the dialectical process starts within thought, looks outside itself in nature, and then brings that into itself, also regarding itself as spirit.
is kind of why we see reflection in the sphere of essence, but then it's actually in practice nature.
Yeah. In reality, all of this is connected and all of this is one. It's not two, it's not three, it's one. It's one reality. We're talking about a monism here that understands understands human understands humanity and nature as part of the same thing, and understanding both of those extremes, both humanity and nature, within thought itself, self-organized as a system. Okay, I think the final. I don't have it in front of me right now, but I think the final and most important, I guess, resultant syllogism is where logic is the middle term, the bringing together the extremes of spirit and nature together into the understanding of all of reality as one being completely, right? So this kind of gets to how Hegel organizes a view of
Yeah.
all of reality.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tempting to look at the tripartite syllogisms that make up this system of logic, nature, and spirit as a linear development or a historical development, et cetera, et cetera. But you've got to remember that the syllogism brings together two extremes in one middle term. And this is a very philosophical and logical. I sound like Trump here. This is the most philosophical ever. We've got great logic.
You would never use the word philosophical.
He wouldn't. He'd have to read it off a damn teleprompter. But yeah, when you're looking at syllogistic logic, the middle term is always the one in which the extremes are brought together and understood in their unity, as well as their difference, if that makes any sense. And the fact that he shuffles the syllogism around in three different forms, right, addresses each term as it brings together the other two extremes. Okay, it's that middle term in each of the three that you've got to pay attention to as being sort of the what brings both together, right? So the first one, which just reflects the order of the books, logic, nature, spirit. If you look at nature as the particularity that brings together spirit and logic, right? Through nature, humans manifest themselves in how do you say it? In conjunction with what they think, or how they think, or what thought is. Nature brings together nature through the production of our external being. In other words, our brains or whatever combines the meat space with the thought space, if you want to put it that way. And that's the first syllogism. The second, I can't remember what it is. We already talked about the third. Kyle, do you have it in front of you? What's the second?
The second syllogism's disappearance is so far superseded that the syllogism is the standpoint of the mind itself, which, as the mediating agent of process, presupposes nature and couples it with a logical principle.
Yeah. Yeah. It focuses on it focuses on spirit and how it how it combines the two extremes of nature and logic / being. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Really quick here. I know it's 9:10, but I think the most important point is the one I'm about to bring up with 249. So I'm just going to read this out and then I'm going to talk about it really quick. Nature is to be regarded as a system of stages, one arising necessarily from the other and being the proximate truth of the stage from which it results. but it is not generated naturally out of the other, but only in the inner idea which constitutes the ground of nature. Now, when reading this, nature is uppercase. It is the concept of nature, okay? The dialectical notion which leads forward the stages is the inner side of them. A thinking consideration must reject such nebulous, at bottom, sensuous ideas, as in particular the so-called origination, for example, of plants and animals from water, and then the origination of the more highly developed animal organisms from the lower, and so on. Hegel here is not making a statement that rejects the idea of evolution. That's the first thing to say right off the bat, okay? It looks like he is. Okay, here we come to the most difficult part of conceiving a philosophy of nature. That historical procedure is different from a logical procedure that occurs in thought. Okay? Hegel here is not disputing the historical, but insisting on the philosophy of nature being solely a logical treatise in its structure. Okay? This is the most important thing to keep in mind, because as we go forward and he talks about natural objects as from space and time all the way up through the organic forms in the third section, right? You're going to get the idea that he's sorry, I pretty much made my point there. Yeah. Here you can see, he says, the notion timelessly and in a universal manner posits all particularity in existence. Chronological difference has no interest whatever for thought. Okay, so he acknowledges the historical dimension of nature and how it works and what it produces, but that is not the subject of the philosophy of nature in its logical structure. Let's see here. He says, in a system, sorry, what did I do there? Delete. In a system, it is the most abstract term which is the first, and the truth of each sphere is the last. But this again is only the first of a higher sphere. It is the necessity of the idea which causes each sphere to complete itself by passing into another higher one, and the variety of forms must be considered as necessary and determinate. Here he's, again, talking about his system as a whole and how it logically functions. Right after this, he has a section that's very interesting, and again, to untutored eyes can seem anti-evolutionary, but it is not. When he says the animal did not develop naturally out of the aquatic animal, nor did it fly into the air on leaving the water, nor did perhaps the bird again fall back to earth. He's talking about the logical state, different stages of nature, as a concept in thought, not as it appears outside of us historically and chronologically. Again, these are not the same thing. But that's the biggest difficulty in reading this. Let's see here. So he says, the desire to know the necessity of this development leads to the search for a law of the series, a basic determination which, while positing difference, repeats itself in such difference, and in doing so also produces a fresh difference. And he's talking about how to organize the concepts of nature. But to enlarge a series merely by the successive addition of elements similarly determined, and to see only the same relationship between all the members of the series, is not the way in which the notion generates its determinations. Again, if you've read Thomas Kuhn, This is tantamount to saying we've gathered a bunch of data and we've just sort of stacked it up in our hard drive arbitrarily based on when we gathered that information. It is this very fact of imagining a series of stages and the like which has been a hindrance to any progress in understanding the necessity of the various forms of nature. And also why the classes and genera and whatnot are organized in our science books quite arbitrarily. To seek to arrange in serial form the planets, the metals, or chemical substances in general, plants and animals, and then to ascertain the law of the series is a fruitless task because nature does not arrange its forms in such articulate series. This is another way of saying that the notion is inward or innate, implicit in nature. It is not explicit. Okay, looking at natural objects, it's not immediately obvious where one would classify that object or its aspects just by looking at it. Okay, does that make sense to you guys here? That's a more explicit way to say that nature is has the idea only implicitly. It's not immediately determinable just by looking at it, where to classify it. The notion differentiates things according to their own specific qualitative character, and to that extent advances by leaps. And Lenin would love this section because the dialectical leap from quality to quantity is definitely implied here. I don't know my Latin. I wish I did. Let's see. Here's 250, and really this is the end of the section on the notion of nature. The contradiction of the idea arising from the fact that as nature, it is external to itself, is more precisely this: that on the one hand, there is the necessity of its forms, which is generated by the notion, and their rational determination in the organic totality. Basically, he's talking about how thought, properly conceived logically, is organizing these forms. Okay. While on the other hand, there is their indifferent contingency and indeterminate irregularity. All right. In the sphere of nature, contingency and determination from without has its right, and this contingency is at its greatest in the realm of concrete individual forms, which, however, as products of nature, are concrete only in immediate manner. So you go out, you find natural objects, none of them appear in the show, in your reflection, as you look at them, to be connected at all. Okay? The immediately concrete thing is a group of properties external to one another and more or less indifferently related to each other. Basically what I just said. And for that very reason, the simple subjectivity which exists for itself is also indifferent and abandons them to contingent and external determination. Hang on just a second. Yeah.
Those. And so now thinking backward, I guess when explore more, he talks about how in spirit the fundamental form of necessity is a triad, but then further it can resolve itself into a terad or a pentad. What exactly that means in terms of like the syllogistic nature of the method of the dialectical method. Because I still want to plumb that depth.
Okay, sorry about that. So where was I? This is this is another thing that Hegel says. This is the impotence of nature, that it preserves the determinations of the notion only abstractly and leaves their detailed specification to external determination. This is another way of saying that it's not immediately obvious where to classify what you find in nature, and it's only left to external, i.e., from our point of view, determination, right? The impotence of nature to adhere strictly to the notion in its realization lies the difficulty and in most cases the impossibility of finding fixed distinctions for classes and orders from an empirical consideration of nature. It doesn't mean we don't try. If you open up any high school biology textbook, you will find all of the information to do with nature where life is concerned organized. But it's more arbitrary and more bric-a-brac and more dependent on a metaphysics that's unexamined or only partially examined than one ordered by what the philosophy of nature is supposed to lend to the information. And that's what Hegel's project is in this book, is to provide a scaffolding that will order the information, any information from any scientific study, logically self-consistent and self-subsistent, if that makes sense. It's the exact same ordering system, more or less, as in his entire system when he looks at logic and he looks at spirit, or humanity in general. He's also trying to apply to nature. Yeah. What did I say here? I'll just finish off with this. In the impotence of nature to adhere strictly to the notion in its realization lies the difficulty, and in many cases the impossibility of finding fixed distinctions for classes and orders from an empirical consideration of nature. Nature everywhere blurs the essential limits of species and genera by intermediate and defective forms, which continually furnish counterexamples to every fixed distinction. And what he talks about with this is that if you look at nature just from its starting from the whole of whatever you find and try to particularize from that, and on the other hand, from an evolutionary standpoint, where you start from the simplest forms and go up to the most concrete and most evolved forms, both of these, how do I say this? Both of these, both evolutionary and as well as the emanation thesis, are both one-sided. It has to be both. Both have to, in a reciprocal manner, inform each other, is what Hegel is saying. So starting both from the most abstract to the concrete, but also taking into account what the whole is in order to inform the particularities, right? Is kind of how you do it. And he finishes off talking about the division, or the table of contents of the philosophy of nature. And this is where I'll pretty much end it. The idea as nature is one, in the determination of asunderness or mutual outsideness, of infinite separatedness, the unity of form being outside it. This unity as ideal is only in itself and is consequently a unity which is only sought. This is matter and its ideal system mechanics. Okay. 2, in the determination of particularity, so that reality is posited with an immanent determinateness of form and with an existent difference in it. This is a relationship of reflection, whose being within self is natural individuality, or physics. Finally, in the determination of subjectivity, in which the real differences of form are also brought back to the ideal unity, which has found itself and is for itself organics. This division is made from the standpoint of the notion or the concept grasped in its totality, and it indicates the diremption of the notion in its determinations. And since in this diremption the notion explicates its determinations and gives them a self-subsistence, though only as moments, the process is one of self-realization in which the notion posits itself as idea. Okay? Each stage is a specific realm of nature, and all appear to have independent existence, but the last is the concrete unity of all the preceding ones. So when looking at nature as a whole, right, looking at its parts through the lens of mechanics, physics, and finally organics, the resulting whole is populated by these separately looked at realms, but the realms are only artificially separate, right? There is only in reality the whole, right? And I have to step away for just a few minutes. I'll be right back. But go ahead and talk about, well, anything that we just talked about. I'll be right back.
Yeah, it's just actually I guess I can grab it. I was just thinking of the well, I don't even call it a comment here that, and it was that quite naive sense that Herrick once challenged the philosophy of nature before defeated ducting only his pen, which again reminds me of Neil deGrasse Tyson and what tell me when philosophy can do, make an observation in physics. Which was that? It is imagined that the more trivial and isolated the object, the easier is the task deducing it.
Okay, sorry, lots of dead air there.
Yeah. I think we're already pretty much about done.
Yeah. So, yeah, for the audience watching, you're probably like, what happened there? But we're to the point where we're pretty much done covering the introduction. If I would say if there are any questions, leave a comment on the YouTube page where you've watched this, and we'll try to address it. We didn't really do that with the science of logic, but I mean, you know, you could have. Yeah, if there are any questions, you can do that. The next section starts with mechanics, and that is well where the logical notion of nature begins. And honestly, I give me a second because I'd like to give a reading assignment
Okay.
for next time because I'm wondering like how are we going to do this? I think it might be a good idea to read through each of the subsections in their fullness. I didn't really do that in full with this introduction, but because most of the main entries are so short, we can do that just fine, and then discuss the remarks and the zusats, uh, what do we call them in the science of logic? It was the extended remarks or lecture notes. And we can just talk about those. We don't have to read everything out in its fullness.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But here, give me just a second. Why don't we?
There it is.
Okay, so A, space and time consists of one, space, two, time, and then three, place and motion. And that ends on page 44. We start at page 28. So why don't we read from page 28 to 44, and for this first week. It seems like a lot, but really all we're going to do when we come to the next section or the next session next Monday is we're going to read out the main entries from subsection 254 to 260, which are pretty. Each one of them are pretty short, and we'll just discuss the contents as we go. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Mhm.
All right. Looking forward to it. Thank you, comrades. Thank you, audience members who are watching, friends, comrades, and just generally interested parties. Looking forward to seeing you next Monday. Take it easy.